In the vast tapestry of American currency, an ink thread weaves through the mid-1800s, the Mormon gold coins. Let's explore the story of these coins, a story etched in gold, faith, and American history. As settlers ventured west, the United States was a mosaic of currencies. Among these, Mormon gold coins emerged, minted from 1849 to 1860, by a burgeoning community in Utah Territory. The man at the helm was Brigham Young, a leader whose vision extended beyond the spiritual. He orchestrated the minting of coins, a tangible affirmation of the Mormon community's industrious spirit. Cast and stamped in gold, the Mormon coins were a canvas for a lexicon of sacred symbols, each with a profound message. The all-seeing eye of Jehovah, a constant on the obverse, was a divine testament to watchfulness and protection. Accompanying this symbol was the Phrygian crown, also known as the bishop's mitre, an emblem of the holy priesthood and a nod to ancient traditions of liberty. By 1850, 9 stars encircled the eye, a celestial symbol of God's judgment. As the years progressed, the inscription "Holiness to the Lord," taken directly from the book of Exodus, graced the coins, affirming the settlers' commitment to their faith. The year 1860 introduced the Beehive, a representation of industry and cooperation. That would become the emblem of the burgeoning state of Deseret, later known as Utah. The clasped hands on the reverse signaled friendship, and the collective strength found in unity. Though marked with GSLCPG, which stands for Great Salt Lake City Pure Gold, but history tells us the gold hailed from the rich fields of California. And last but not least, the majestic Lion of Judah guarded the coins, symbolizing power and the leadership of the community. These designs were a silent sermon in metal, speaking volumes of the settlers' values and resolve. But these coins were more than mere currency. They were a necessity. The gold rush had flooded the West with precious metal, yet there was a dearth of coinage. Mormon battalion members, having toiled in California's gold fields, brought back the bounty that would become the Mormon coins. But their minting process was rudimentary, and the expertise limited. The coins, marked pure gold, were anything but. Assays performed by the U.S. Mint revealed a bitter truth. The gold was debased, the coins underweight. Despite this, Mormon gold coins narrate a tale of ambition. They are relics of an era when the frontier was a forge of nation-building, a testament to the pursuit of community in the face of adversity. Today, these coins are numismatic crowns, rare and valued. Auctions whisper tales of their worth, with prices soaring into the stratosphere for the few that survive melting pots and time's test. Let's take a closer look at the exquisite Mormon gold coins. First, we marvel at the 1849 $20 gold piece, a coin steeped in history. This coin was one of the first to be struck using California gold. Its obverse showcases a striking 3-point Phrygian crown, symbolizing priesthood above the all-seeing eye of Jehovah, an ode to the divine. Today, this coin is not just rare. It's a collector's dream, with value skyrocketing into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Next, we have the 1850 $5 gold coin, a testament to the evolving craftsmanship of the Mormon Mint. This coin features a modified Phrygian cap and a halo over the eye of God, reflecting amaturation in design and symbolism. And on the reverse, the clasped hands remain, a symbol of unity and brotherhood. These coins are incredibly scarce, with only a few known to exist. Their rarity and historical significance push their value to extraordinary heights in the numismatic market. Lastly, the 1860 $5 gold coin. The final issue from the Mormon Mint reveals a complete redesign. On its face, the Lion of Judah stands proudly, encircled by the words "Holiness to the Lord" inscribed in the Deseret alphabet, signaling the deep religious conviction of its creators. The reverse side features an eagle, wings unfurled, perched behind a beehive, with the inscription, "Deseret as he offers pure gold," framing the scene. However, this declaration of purity wasn't entirely accurate. The gold source from the mountains of California was in fact not the full 24 carats. But that is for another video. These coins are incredibly rare, with only a handful known to exist. Their numismatic value reflects their rarity, fetching prices often reserved for the most coveted of historical artifacts. Yet, in the end, Mormon gold coins are not just artifacts. They are chronicles of a fledgling community's pursuit of identity and autonomy in a land brimming with promise and challenge. As our journey through the legacy of Mormon gold concludes, we're left with a sense of wonder for the stories they hold as a currency of history, minted by the valiant for the ages. A veteran metals and grand archive production, Metal or Die.